I stood there staring at the bright orange violation notice taped to my windshield, feeling the heat rise from my collar to my ears. It wasn't just a ticket, it was a declaration of war from a woman who didn't even own the dirt she was standing on. My driveway, the one I had spent 3 weeks and thousands of dollars carving out of my own wooded acreage, was apparently an unauthorized infrastructure project, according to Mrs. Gable, the self-appointed queen of the Meadowview HOA. She was already marching across the cul-de-sac, her heels clicking like a countdown timer on the pavement, clutching a clipboard to her chest like it was a holy relic. I knew this wasn't going to be a civil conversation because Mrs. Gable didn't do civil, she did compliance, and she did it with a sneer that could wither a cactus. Before we dive into how I turned her $300 fine into a legal nightmare that cost the HOA their most precious asset, comment below which country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The morning had started out so peacefully, with the smell of pine needles and damp earth lingering in the air after a light midnight rain. I had purchased this 20-acre plot specifically because it sat on the very edge of the HOA's jurisdiction, a beautiful buffer zone that gave me the perks of the paved neighborhood road while keeping my actual house hidden deep in the trees. My property line was a jagged thing, a quirk of 19th century surveying that meant I owned a narrow strip of land that ran parallel to the main community entrance. For months, I had been hauling my boat and my work trailer through the HOA's manicured main gates, and for months, Mrs. Gable had been sending me letters about industrial eyesores and unrefined aesthetic choices. So I did what any sensible landowner would do. I decided to build my own private access road on my own land, bypassing their gates entirely and giving myself a straight shot to the county highway. I hired a contractor, laid down high-grade crushed limestone, and felt a sense of pride as I looked at the smooth, pale path cutting through the green. But the peace lasted exactly 6 hours before the HOA's enforcement committee, which was really just Mrs. Gable and her terrified silent partner, Mr. Henderson, showed up at my property line. She didn't knock, she just stood at the edge of my new gravel, pointing a manicured finger at the tire tracks as if they were evidence of a grisly crime. I stepped off my porch, wiping grease from my hands onto a rag, and watched her face turn a shade of purple that matched her expensive silk scarf. She didn't even offer a good morning or a neighborly greeting. She just tapped the clipboard and told me that I had violated Section 4.2 of the bylaws regarding unauthorized modifications to the landscape visible from common areas. Her voice was high and nasal, the kind of sound that sets your teeth on edge, and she spoke with a slow, condescending rhythm as if I were a toddler who had just colored on the walls. I tried to explain that this road was entirely on my private property and didn't touch their common ground, but she wasn't listening. She handed me the paper with a flourish, her eyes gleaming with the misplaced power of a middle manager in a strip mall. It was a $300 fine, payable within 48 hours with an additional $50 per day penalty until the offending gravel was removed and the land was returned to its natural grassy state. I looked at the fine, then at the road, then back at her, feeling a slow, cold realization that this woman truly believed her authority extended past the legal boundaries of her map. Mr. Henderson stood behind her, staring at his shoes, clearly wishing he were anywhere else, but Mrs. Gable was in her element, practically vibrating with the thrill of the hunt. I told her as calmly as I could that I had checked the deeds and the local zoning laws before a single shovelful of dirt was moved, and that my road was perfectly legal. She laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound, and told me that legal didn't matter in Meadowview, only the vision of the board mattered, and her vision didn't include my tacky backwoods trail. As she turned to leave, she threw one last comment over her shoulder about how people like me always tried to skirt the rules but eventually learned that the HOA always won. I watched her walk away, her shadow stretching long across my new limestone, and I felt a shift in my perspective. I wasn't just annoyed anymore, I was motivated. I went inside, grabbed my original property deed, and spent the next 4 hours highlighted in yellow ink, tracing lines that hadn't been looked at since the 1970s. What I found wasn't just a defense against her $300 fine. It was a nuclear option that had been sitting in plain sight for decades. It turns out that the narrow strip of land I owned wasn't just a buffer. It was the original access easement for the entire 200-acre tract that the HOA was built on. My road wasn't just a driveway. It was built directly on top of the only legal ingress and egress point for the back half of the entire development. I spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone with my lawyer, a man who lives for these kinds of technicalities and has a laugh like a gravel crusher. He confirmed what I suspected. When the HOA was incorporated, they had neglected to properly secure the easement from the previous owner, my grandfather. They had been using a handshake agreement for the last 20 years to allow the community's utility trucks, emergency vehicles, and landscaping crews to use a small paved turnoff that crossed my property line. Mrs. Gable, in her infinite wisdom and quest for $300, had just poked a sleeping giant that owned the very ground her common area maintenance crews relied on. I didn't pay the fine that night and I didn't move the gravel. Instead, I went to the hardware store and bought 2 heavy-duty steel posts, a thick chain, and a private property, no trespassing sign that was twice the size of her violation notice. I slept better that night than I had in years, knowing that by sunrise, the power dynamic in Meadowview was about to do a complete 180-degree flip. The next morning, the sound of a heavy diesel engine idling at the edge of my property woke me up earlier than usual. It was the HOA's contracted landscaping crew, a fleet of 3 massive trucks loaded with commercial mowers, mulch, and seasonal flowers, all trying to get to the secret garden park at the center of the neighborhood. Usually they cut across the corner of my land, the very spot where I had just finished installing my new steel posts and a heavy padlock chain. I stood on my porch with a steaming cup of coffee, watching the lead driver scratch his head as he stared at the new barrier and the sign that explicitly forbade any HOA-related transit. Within 10 minutes, the inevitable happened, Mrs. Gable's white SUV came screaming around the corner, skidding to a halt behind the mowers, her face already a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She hopped out of the car, slamming the door so hard I thought the glass might shatter, and stormed toward my fence line with the intensity of a storm front. She started screaming before she even reached the chain, her voice cracking as she demanded to know what this stunt was supposed to be. I didn't say a word. I just took a slow sip of my coffee and pointed toward the sign, which clearly stated that all unauthorized access was prohibited and that violators would be prosecuted. She grabbed the chain and shook it, her face turning that familiar shade of violent purple, screaming that I was obstructing community business and that the HOA had an implied right to use this path. A few neighbors had started to gather on their lawns, drawn by the sound of her screeching, and I could see them whispering and pointing. Mrs. Gable noticed the audience and doubled down, claiming that I was being childish because of a simple, fair fine, and that she was calling the police to have me arrested for interfering with public services. I just nodded and told her to go ahead and make the call because I had some paperwork I'd love to show the officers when they arrived. The police arrived about 15 minutes later, 2 officers who looked like they had dealt with Mrs. Gable's emergencies many times before and were already tired of her before they even stepped out of the cruiser. She rushed them like a frantic bird, waving her clipboard and pointing at me as if I were a fugitive rambling about illegal blockades and safety hazards. One officer, a tall guy with a no-nonsense expression, walked over to me while the other stayed behind to try and calm the hysterical HOA president. I handed him the folder my lawyer had prepared, which contained the original land grant, the survey from last year, and the specific section of the county code regarding private easements. I watched his eyes scan the documents, his eyebrows rising higher with every page he flipped, until he finally looked up at Mrs. Gable and shook his head. He told her, in a voice loud enough for the growing crowd to hear, that I was well within my rights to secure my property and that he couldn't force me to open the chain. The look on Mrs. Gable's face was worth more than any $300 fine. She looked as if the earth had just opened up and swallowed her whole. She tried to argue, claiming the documents must be fakes or that I had tricked the surveyor, but the officer wasn't having it. He told her that if the HOA wanted access to my land, they would have to take it up in civil court, but for now the landscapers were going to have to find another way in, which was a problem, because the only other entrance was a narrow residential bridge that couldn't support the weight of their heavy machinery. The landscaping foreman, realizing they were stuck, began backing his trucks out, the beeping of the reverse alarms sounding like a victory march. Neighbors were now openly laughing, and one guy from 3 houses down even gave me a subtle thumbs up from behind his mailbox. Mrs. Gable was left standing in the middle of the road, her authority evaporating in the morning sun as I leaned against my porch railing and finished my coffee. But the real kicker came an hour later when the HOA's own legal counsel called me, his voice sounding thin and incredibly stressed. It turns out that by blocking that specific strip of land, I hadn't just stopped the mowers. I had also blocked the legal access route for the neighborhood's secondary fire hydrant system and the main electrical transformer pad. Because the HOA had built their infrastructure on presumed access, rather than a recorded easement, they were now technically squatting on my land with their utility equipment. My lawyer had already sent them a notice to vacate, demanding they remove all HOA-owned pipes, wires, and equipment from my property within 30 days or pay a monthly land usage fee of $2,000. The $300 fine she had tried to stick me with was now a drop in the bucket compared to the five-figure legal headache she had just invited into their boardroom. Mrs. Gable had tried to control my driveway, and in the process, she had lost control of the neighborhood's very foundation. The board held an emergency meeting that night, and for the first time in the history of Meadowview, Mrs. Gable wasn't the one holding the gavel. I was invited to attend not as a resident, but as a hostile stakeholder, whose cooperation was now mandatory for the community to function. The room was packed with angry homeowners who had found out that their property values were at risk because one woman wanted to power trip over a gravel road. When I walked in, the silence was deafening, and I could see Mrs. Gable sitting in the back row, her clipboard gone, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. The board vice president, a reasonable man named Dave, apologized profusely for the misunderstanding and handed me a letter. It wasn't a violation notice. It was a formal withdrawal of all fines, a lifetime waiver for my private road, and an offer to buy a permanent easement from me for a price that made my jaw drop. I didn't accept their first offer, of course. I made them sweat for a few weeks, enjoying the sight of Mrs. Gable having to take the long way around every time she left her house because my chain was still up. Eventually, we settled on a deal. They paid me a lump sum that covered the entire cost of my new road, plus a monthly maintenance fee that effectively meant I'd never have to pay HOA dues again for as long as I lived there. As part of the agreement, the board also passed a new set of bylaws that stripped the president of the power to issue fines without a unanimous board vote, effectively neutering Mrs. Gable's reign of terror. She ended up selling her house and moving away 6 months later, unable to handle the disrespect from neighbors who no longer feared her clipboard. I still have that orange violation notice framed in my hallway, a constant reminder that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to let them dig their own hole until they hit something they can't handle. The lesson here is simple. Never try to take someone's land when you don't even know where your own property line ends. Authority without accountability is just a house of cards, and all it takes is one person who knows their rights to blow the whole thing down. My private road is now fully paved, paid for by the very people who tried to fine me for building it, and every time I drive on it, I think of the $300 that almost cost an entire community their peace of mind. If you enjoyed this story of HOA justice, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments, have you ever had to deal with a Mrs. Gable in your own neighborhood? Justice is best served with a side of property law and a very long chain. Remember, your home is your castle, but your land is your fortress. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. What do you think of how this turned out? Would you have been as patient as I was, or would you have shut down the whole neighborhood on day one? Let me know your thoughts and stay tuned for the next one where a neighbor tries to build a fence through my living room. See you in the next story.